All right, you may begin the meeting, Mr. Vice Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clerk and Mr. Clerk. Good evening, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order. The first order of business is to have an approval of the agenda. Could I have a mover and seconder, please? Councillor Holland, Councillor McLaren, all in favor? That passes. We're not going to have confirmation of minutes because this is a special meeting of administrative policies. So we'll move to the next item, which is disclosure of pecuniary interest. Seeing none. There are no delegations tonight, so we'll move right into briefings. The first is from Ms. Kennedy, the Chief Financial Officer and City Treasurer, and she'll speak to the committee regarding the adoption of the new procurement bylaw. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a presentation which the clerk has put up on the screen for everybody. And I thought I'd just take the opportunity just to introduce the new procurement bylaw that staff are proposing, and a little bit of the history as to how we got to where we are today with this. And then I'm going to turn it over to our Manager of Procurement, Ahmed Zayan, to walk us through some of the changes within the bylaw, sort of some of the key things that we want council to be aware of. So if we could turn to the next slide, please. Just a bit of a history of the procurement bylaw. This bylaw has been in place since 2006, so it's 14 years old and was definitely time for a revamping, a review and revamping to update it. And so in that regard, as part of the finance work plan, we've been looking at this probably the last couple of years, certainly since Ahmed joined us, in terms of what we wanted our new bylaw to look like. And certainly when we think about going back 14 years, and Ahmed will be talking about some of the changes to the thresholds, but I did go back and take a look in terms of change going back 14 years to our operating and capital budgets 14 years ago. And I think you'll find as we look at some of the thresholds, the alignment to some of the increases in terms of our spending and our budget in the last 14 years. So our budgets have gone up about, gross budgets, counting capital, up about 67 to 70% over the last 14 years. And so that is certainly reflected in some of the thresholds that we'll be presenting tonight. So in that regard, we've certainly looked at our business practices and our level of procurement and what would an appropriate level be today, 14 years later. We've also looked at some of the progress we've made on some of the other initiatives at modernizing our procurement practices, and that's certainly been part of our work plan the last couple of years, with the objective of improving our processes, creating some structure around some of the processes that we are already carrying out, but actually putting the legislative structure to those processes. Over 14 years, you can appreciate we've put a few Band-Aids on and kept moving. So it was time to build that back into the bylaw structure. And certainly you'll see a lot in the bylaw around the principles of fairness, consistency, transparency in our procurement function, not only transparency to council, but transparency to the market and to the vendor market. And certainly a focus of deploying the best practices today in their supply chain and procurement domain that maybe weren't around 14 years ago. So you can see in the history, we have been in front of council in 2017 and 2018, making some very specific focus changes to the bylaw to address issues that had arisen. 2017, we had some issues around the new trade treaty rules at the time, and around the issue of the binding nature of our evaluation criteria. And we felt we were putting council in a position where we were bringing items to council for approval that had already gone through the evaluation criteria, particularly where we did the criteria and we weren't picking the lowest bid. And so our bylaw had required us to come to council. But the trade treaty certainly emphasizes the binding nature of the criteria that are set out up front. And there shouldn't be that process at the other end to potentially throw that out and just choose another supplier. And so we brought that in 2017 to update the bylaw around that. as well as a minor change in 2018 to adjust for some of our workers' compensation insurance requirements for some of our more lower risk vendors, where we were expecting quite a bit for the risk analysis of particular vendors that we were hiring. So you can see there hasn't been a lot of change since 2006, and certainly a time for doing that. The other piece that council or the committee will recall is that a couple of years ago, we put in our new financial management system, and a big piece of that was putting the technology in around the procurement. So our whole procurement process prior to that, our purchase orders, our tracking was all done manually. We've now built it in the system. The advantage of that, of course, is we're starting to build data that we'll be able to go back and review and look at exactly what we're purchasing and how we're purchasing, who we're purchasing from, and that will provide us some useful data going forward. And then finally, certainly there's been some more recent changes to the trade treaty legislation, and so we wanted to make sure that those were built in to our rules. While we don't have a lot of suppliers coming from certainly across the ocean out of the country, the trade treaty agreements still are beneficial in terms of a review and making sure we align with them because they ensure that the government procurement activities that they're conducted in a non-discriminatory, impartial, transparent, fair, accountable manner. And that aligns with what our policies are, what our principles are within the bylaw. So certainly they're a good test for us to make sure that we are in accordance with them and that we are not getting ourselves into trouble down the line. The other thing I just wanted to mention in terms of the history, important to note, the document does look different to you, but a lot of the substance within the document has not changed. Our previous or our current bylaw right now does have quite a bit of more process related type information in it, and that was just the structure that was used 14 years ago. We've tried to change that, and we've worked quite a bit with legal throughout this process to ensure that the bylaw reflected the governance pieces. So those pieces that council needs to approve to know that staff are then complying with those rules. So those overriding rules, that governance level. And so we've ensured that we've pulled out the procedural type information, and that will be included, and that will be part of our protocols for staff in terms of how do you actually carry out the function to ensure you are in compliance with the bylaw that council has approved. So we've cleaned up that structure a little bit. So you will, if you go through, see some of the things have not changed. There's still 3 quote requirements, requirements for going to the market, the way we do evaluation processes, use of contracts and being approved by legal over a certain threshold. So a lot of those foundational pieces have not changed. But there are some changes that Ahmed is going to walk us through with respect to the thresholds themselves, which goes back to the fact we are a growing corporation and we're different than we were 14 years ago, as well as some of the approval and reporting pieces that we think it's important for council to know in terms of approving this bylaw. Next slide, please. So I think I've covered most of this, but just in terms of our process, we did start this process using a company called the Procurement Office, which is a top procurement law consulting firm in Canada, and does a lot of work for the public sector, a lot of work for our municipal colleagues. And so they have helped us in drafting the bylaw. They've also helped us in drafting a number of the protocols that we'll be looking at rolling out over the next couple of years. And a lot of our templates, our sourcing templates that we actually take now to market, they've had some input on those. But we've also spent quite a few hours with our legal folks. They've been very helpful in going through this document and making it more Kingston owned, and ensuring that we have the right rules within the bylaw that will help us if we ever do find ourselves within a litigation situation, that we've at least got our documents and our rules correct right up front. So certainly thanks to our legal folks for a lot of work that they've done for us in that regard. And we've certainly looked at this from a risk-based approach. So looking at the small dollar amounts, the big dollar amounts, the contracted services, supplies, and goods. We've looked at all through a risk-based approach in terms of what these rules should be and what the thresholds should be. And looking at how do we leverage within the market, how do we better leverage market capabilities, innovation, and do we have the flexibility to do that? And then finally, we've certainly looked at other municipalities of similar size and scope. We looked at some local municipalities, but we also looked at ones within Ontario that were closer to our population, with the assumption that, and actually confirming that their budgets also were within line with ours, and that the thresholds would certainly be comparable. And then, of course, we've informed by a lot of past experience over the last 14 years and some of the lessons that we've learned, and made sure that they've also been incorporated in. So I'm going to turn it over now to Ahmed. You probably have not met Ahmed Zayan. He's been with us for about 2 years now. Ahmed is a procurement specialist. He has an MBA in supply chain management. Came to us from Amazon, so certainly a corporation that does lots of procurement. That was the good news. The bad news is Ahmed is actually leaving us. He's heading to another opportunity in Ukraine. I hope it's okay to say that, Ahmed. So we're sorry to see him go. He has certainly moved us forward in terms of procurement best practice in this corporation since he came. He's brought a lot of private sector perspective for us, and some of the best practices that come along with this, and I think has certainly moved us into a more formalized procurement division, and more formalized processes and practices. So I'm glad he's been able to stick around. And if there's one good thing with the COVID, it's that we got to keep him for a little while longer, and certainly get us to this point in terms of this draft bylaw. So I think at this point I will turn it over to Ahmed and to finish up the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Des, for that great introduction. And indeed, it has been a pleasure to work with you and the team for over the past 2.5 years. Always nice to hear that that some of your work is making some progress. And I'm pleased to meet all of you council members today. This is the first time I am presenting in front of you, it seems like it is also the last. But I'm I'm very happy to be presenting to you what we believe is a strong procurement bylaw that will move the city forward and really achieve some successes and some savings as well. I'd like to just quickly just start with saying or introducing kind of the procurement division, and really from a procurement perspective, what our role, the way that I see it, is within the organization. One of the main functions I like to summarize for us is ensuring that we safeguard or maintain the principles of free market, as we hopefully all believe and hold dear to our hearts. And so that's kind of a broad sense. And the way we do that obviously is by partnering with businesses and the departments on the ground throughout their procurement process from the very beginning all the way to the very end, to the award of the contract, and even working with those suppliers as well. So we work with them throughout the process as a means of a quality check throughout that process. And we do our best to implement and create the controls, and we also do our best to ensure that we communicate to the market that we are indeed safeguarding these principles of a free market and an open competition. The reason why we find it very important to communicate that to the market, because at the end of the day, if the market believes in our processes and the credibility of them, we will see more innovation, and we will see more competitiveness, and we will see more bidders that ultimately want to work with us as a number one customer for them as well, we hope. So just a quick introduction in terms of how I see kind of the role of procurement within the organization and what we try to strive for. So what I'd like to go through now is just some of the key changes that we've highlighted that we think is important for council to be aware of. And one of the first things that we did is obviously look at our procurement thresholds and see if that makes sense in today's environment. And like Des mentioned, obviously it's been a number of years since we've last updated it, so it was definitely due to see if they still make sense. one of the things that we do when determining the thresholds is looking at it from a savings perspective, from a business perspective, and does it make sense? And so what do I mean by that? There's kind of a rule of thumb within procurement that, you know, obviously having a competitive situation, oh, thank you. Having a competitive situation or competitive process does reap savings. Usually these savings range from about 0.1% to about 5% on the total value of that contract. And so that's just a rule of thumb that we go by. And so one of the things that we did first is we raised the lower threshold for 3 quotes from what was 5,000 to 15,000. So very quickly, the rationale here is that looking into how long it takes to actually do a competitive process, you know, try to find some research, try to find some suppliers, reach out to them, try to reach out and contact them a couple of times, put together a document with your peers and colleagues, send it out to them, get a response, evaluate, and then in some cases do a contract. So it takes about, you know, on average, 3 or 4 days from staff time, which we on average equated to about $1,000. And if you look at, even if we reach the higher end of that 5% rule of thumb, that's, you know, on a $15,000 purchase, that's about $750 savings that we'll be getting. So you could see, you know, we're at some point it starts to not make sense to do all that work for the potential savings that would be coming. So that's a little bit of the logic behind driving the 5 to 15. It's somewhat similar driving the 50 to 100. Similarly, right, if you look at what time and effort it takes to actually do an open competition, this is, I don't know if anybody has been involved in a procurement process before, but this is in the public sector quite a cumbersome and robust process. This requires review of a number of individuals, legal, procurement, sometimes several procurement people, and sometimes more than 3 or 4 individuals within the departments. They are literally drafting what could be more than a 20 or 30-page document. We are always challenging them to always be more clear and specific. So this back and forth process takes quite a while, and definitely can take some time. And we also have a control internally to have at least 3 evaluators. So again, this takes time for them to actually evaluate the proposals. And in some cases on large projects, we will receive 4, 5, 6 bids, and each of those bids are sometimes 60 to 70 pages each. So we mandate on all departments to actually read every single word, obviously to ensure the fairness of the process, and to also input very clear and detailed evaluation scores and comments. And then we move into contract execution, and we engage with legal, and there's sometimes a long process there in finalizing the contract with the supplier and so on. So, you know, this is very much a cumbersome process. And so when we looked at the evaluation of some of the time that goes into that, we just kind of said rule of thumb is about 3 weeks, 4 weeks of full-time equivalent staff. So again, if you look at, even if we achieve, so that's about $3,000 or $4,000 it costs the city to do a procurement process. And so if you look at, even if we achieve the utmost 4 or 5% of the savings for a $100,000 purchase, it starts to kind of not making sense anymore, right? So you can kind of see the logic there. But, you know, really more importantly than just that, on the $100,000 threshold, the driving factor was the trade treaties. There is a very significant and very specific regulations around how we conduct procurement processes above $100,000. And so internally, one of the things we wanted to do is gain some of those efficiencies in our internal procedures when we're dealing with open procurements for all of them, right? We didn't want to have a more rigorous procedure for some and a less rigorous or a different rigorous procedure for others. And so we wanted to standardize our internal processes just to gain some efficiencies as well. So we just said, you know, $100,000 seems about right, both from a risk perspective, but also from a business perspective too. And also we obviously made sure that we're in comparison with other municipalities and our peers of similar size and scope, and surely I think $100,000 is right across the board, even for larger municipalities, or even smaller municipalities for that matter as well. And again, the driving factor there is of course the trade treaties, right? So that was some of the logic behind driving for some of those thresholds to move up a little bit, to align with the trade treaties and just to align with some general commercial sense as well. I'm going to move on to the next slide, please. And so going along with that logic in terms of trying to maintain that we stay aligned with trade treaty requirements and regulations, we also redefined in the procurement bylaw the definitions and the use of non-standard procurements. And so this is whenever a competitive situation is required, sometimes there's an exception for that matter, and those exceptions are clearly defined in the trade treaty. So we wanted to make sure that there's enough control for that. And so we have added also, in addition to defining it correctly in our bylaw and updating it with the latest amendments of the trade treaties, we've also added mandatory procurement involvement for any of these non-standard procurements for above 100,000, just to have that extra level of control as well. We've also done the same with emergency procurement, again, updated those definitions to align with trade treaty requirements. Now, if we go to the next slide, we've also made a number of additional controls for contract extensions and amendments, so that once the procurement process is over, our role there is not over. We've clearly defined in our new bylaw the distinction between what is a contract option and a change order and a scope change. These are again aligned with trade treaty definitions, and now we have controls in place to ensure that we are meeting those definitions as well. So contract options are scenarios where everything has already been predefined within the procurement process. So there's very little risk when we want to exercise some of those options later on. So we have given the authority for directors to move forward with those without procurement involvement. However, when it comes to change orders as well, there is some risk there. So we have mandated procurement awareness of those change orders that are above $100,000. Again, aligning with that trade treaty threshold for review, and just making sure that this is truly a change order that's allowable, or if it's truly a scope change. And I think scope changes is an interesting area that we've changed as well, and we've actually included council involvement in scope changes, which hasn't been in the past, and we saw that necessary because of the associated risk here. Now, what happens is scope changes, significant change orders from the original procurement document can actually be considered a separate procurement on its own. So it's a significant scope change, and in some sense could be considered a separate project. And so once that line is crossed, we wanted to make sure council is involved and aware of this this scope change or this project as well. So that's why we've added that there, again, just for that additional level of control. Now, if you go on to the next slide, please. We've also done a number of other things, and I'm going to open it up for questions afterwards if anybody wants to dive into any of these in specific detail, but just very high level. Some of the things that we've also added is we've expanded the capability for rosters, and we have actually informally been understanding that there's a interest of this from the market, and obviously from a procurement best practices perspective, we absolutely agree. I think there's opportunity here to increase the use of roster lists. In the past, it was maxed at a valuation of $50,000 in our past bylaw. Now we've aligned it with the trade treaty of what allowable amounts, which basically is dealt with as any valuation. So basically no limit, right? However, there are specific controls for rosters that are in the trade treaties. And so we have mandated procurement involvement for any award to any suppliers on those roster lists. They have to come through procurement, and procurement ensures that we're doing that in a fair way as well. We also expanded the use of cooperative buying. This is a huge tapped opportunity for the city. We do foresee significant savings here. So this is sometimes provincial or federal even, or just group buying public institutions that come together and leverage the volume of all of them together, and they do contracts and get better pricing. So that's something that we've allowed for in the new bylaw as well. Of course, it does come through procurement, and procurement does the financial analysis to make sure that it does make sense for the city. We've added a supplier code of conduct. This is externally facing for our suppliers as a way to set the expectations of what our requirements are for when you are bidding with the city. This is a best practice to ensure that suppliers are aligned, and that obviously it also protects us from a legal perspective for any discrepancies or disputes in the future as well. We've added the ability to suspend suppliers for those who are either performing very badly and have costed the city significant amounts of money, or if they have actually done something unethical, or something like price fixing or bid rigging. So if something that they've done that is unethical or violated the law, that and somehow, again, that has given us the opportunity to suspend those suppliers so that we don't work with them in the future, obviously for a defined period of time, and they also have the opportunity to come back and prove that they've dealt with those risks as well. We've also added an extra layer of control. This is something that I'm particularly excited about. This is a procurement review panel that basically is a panel that has a couple of permanent members and some moving members based on the procurement. The permanent members, of course, is always procurement, and legal support as well is always there. And then the moving members is two departments, so two directors or above, as kind of a peer review process, right? So this ensures that we are making decisions and we're aligned, and there is some sort of consensus on that. Also, it does make sense because sometimes there are suppliers that work with various departments, and so it does make sense that we have a consensus and work as a kind of a one unit when we, for the city when we do make these kinds of decisions. So I think we can, and just to also quickly highlight, the procurement review panel makes decisions in areas of supplier suspension, any procurement protests. If any supplier has protested or disputed an existing process, that will go straight to the procurement review panel as well. So those are some other interesting features that we have added as well. Now, if we could just move on to the next slide. Some of the things that I'd like to summarize for you is basically what has changed from your perspective, right? So non-standard procurement requests greater than $500,000, they will be coming now to council. The total length of any contracts that are over 5 years as well, we thought that that's a good number for it to come to council. And also, of course, if any of the delegated authority conditions are not met, they do go to council. And of course, the standard delegated authority conditions is that there's an approved budget and so on. So whenever those are not available, it has to go to council as well. Council is no longer required for situations where less than 3 quotes when there was an open competition, or any sole sources that were less than $500,000. And I believe also coordinated or group buying requests also were coming to council. So council is no longer required for those. And then the council reporting will continue. And so what we will be doing is providing a monthly report for all open competitions above $100,000, and of course the emergency purchases. And this as well gives council the opportunity to comment from a strategic level on any trends or things that are happening, and they would like for us to make any changes or just kind of deal with any issues as they see fit. So those are some of the things that I think we'd like to make sure that you are aware of, and obviously to give you the assurances with the new bylaw that we do have an extended number of controls and procedures in place to ensure both fair and transparent process, but also to give the business opportunity to react and leverage existing opportunities that are in the market as well. So with that, I think my short presentation will come to an end. If it was up to me, I can talk about procurement until tomorrow, but I want to make sure I'm addressing all your concerns. So I'll open it up to you for any questions or areas that you'd like to dive into.
Thank you very much. And I see that the chair has arrived, Councillor Stroud, so I'll be happy to return him the chair. I just want to say a reminder to the committee before I do that. This is a briefing, so it's appropriate now to ask questions in response to what we've heard or other aspects of the report. But if we're going to comment or dive a bit deeper, that can come in the business section of the meeting, which is actually after this. And the first item of the business section is this very report. So questions to staff now is appropriate. And with that, Councillor Stroud.
Thanks, Mr. Vice Chair. I think you're doing a great job, and I don't know what procedure states, but I'd be fine if you continued chairing the meeting. I don't know if the clerk, is there anything prohibiting that from happening, Mr. Clerk?
No, it does not. I understand that you're perhaps still at work, Mr. Chair. So if you may be coming and going, it may be best for the Vice Chair to proceed, but I'll leave it to you, you two, to decide how you wish.
No, I actually was permitted to leave early by my boss in a very strange and rare occurrence of a canceled surgery. So that we are allowed to downstaff, and they let me go just a little while ago. So I am available for the whole meeting, but I did just arrive and just log on. So I'm happy to let the Vice Chair continue. I do have a few questions as a member of the committee. Maybe I can just start with one of those.
Yeah, sure.
Without taking the chair. So, so first of all, just a little background history, because it's chronologically in the report. It said in the report that council actually passed a motion in 2007, March 6, 2007, to provide additional information on signed contracts awarded by senior staff between 20,000 and 50,000. And I understand from our briefing that it's recommending that we essentially repeal that and go back to 50,000 for the threshold. So my question is, what was motivating council of the day, if Ms. Kennedy can remember, in 2007, why did council impose that additional reporting requirement?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So I can't remember what I had for breakfast, but yes, I can remember that. So I can give a bit of background on what that was. That was during the time when council priorities were called the Group of Seven, and we had a number of projects on the go, including some that were of more interest to the public than others, particularly the Leon Center, as it was called differently back then, the Leon Center, the Invista Center, the Grand Theater. We had a group of 7 projects that were happening. And we had a couple of council members who, through that process with those projects, was trying to sort of stay on top of some of the dollars that were being spent on them. And so I believe that really drove the motion to include 20 to 50. I can't tell you why the 20. I think that sort of was just a choice of the council member that moved the motion. But at that point, we were doing 50,000 and above as a report, and they wanted 20 to 50. They actually, if I remember correctly, were focusing on more contracted and consulting service type things. But we ended up doing it for everything. Frankly, it was a little easier for us than pulling out specific ones just to report everything between the 20 and the 50. So it was certainly around the group of 7 days. And I think that was some of the motivation then with some of the procurement activity that was happening with those projects.
Hey, that's very helpful. My second question has to do with what Ahmed was referring to as like the robust public bidding process requirements, which can be very time consuming to staff. Is it not also true that the reason that these robust requirements exist is in the interest of transparency, with large amounts of money at stake and the bidding process, to ensure that we're not accused of favoritism and to ensure that of a fair bidding process? Is that not sort of where all these requirements come from this this public need for transparency in the bidding process?
So through you, Mr. Chair, yes, you're absolutely correct. That robustness is a foundational piece of making sure that we are transparent and we are fair and we're following the rules that have been laid out and that suppliers know what those rules are. Mr. Zayan may have a little more to add, but I think he was speaking within the context of the cost of that process and the while you want to be transparent, there's also the savings and the risk of the reputation around the transparency. And obviously, as your value goes up, there's more risk of that, and you want to have more robust processes. So that's why sort of the levels, and he was looking at it from the savings standpoint, but I think it also makes sense from the reputational standpoint and the confidence that the suppliers have in our processes. We want to have more robust processes, the higher the dollar values are. And I don't know if there's something you wanted to add to that.
No, absolutely. I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. That is absolutely correct. The robustness is there to ensure the transparency, and we indeed uphold that. The idea of aligning it with $100,000 as a threshold is because there are additional robustness and requirements that come from trade treaties. And so we want to make sure we are including those where we are required to. And like Des kind of alluded to, those are the high risk ones. And so we want to make sure that we have proper and robust procedures there for $100,000. And at the same time, we are always in the back of our minds considering how we can be more efficient and how we can save monies for our taxpayers. And so that's something that we kind of look at secondary. But obviously, our primary requirement is to make sure that we have the proper, robust procedures where the high risk ones are, and that's $100,000, which what we've done is aligning with the trade treaties. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that didn't delude my initial message.
So if I could paraphrase, so what you're saying is in that lower amount, in under 100,000, because right now the threshold, say, is at 50,000 for some of these, in that $50,000 to $100,000 range, because the amount is the amount of money today, it does not represent the same level of risk as it once did, and therefore it's not really justified to have the extra robustness that you get at the higher thresholds with that relatively lower amount, although that still sounds like a lot of money to members of the public. Is that basically what you're saying? Is that it's not worth the extra effort of the robustness with those lower amounts because the risk is so much lower? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's important to recognize that even though a procedure does not go through the high robustness required in trade treaties or through an open competition, it does not mean that we are not fair and transparent, right? And it does not mean that we still do not go through an evaluation process in our supplier selection. And so that's I think an important piece to recognize. So we want to make sure that we are always 100% fair and transparent in all our spend. And so for the 3-quote requirement, which is from 15 to 100,000, we ensure that there is a evaluation process. We ensure that our departments are selecting the best supplier for the job. And so that is also a fair and transparent process. The requirement around the $100,000 threshold is also equally, I would argue, fair and transparent. The only difference is there is a larger body that governs what we do. So even though we are being fair and transparent, we need to make sure that we are abiding by all those procedures and regulations for that procedure, for that open competition procedure. And so there is a higher risk there of a perceived not having fair and transparent process, right? Even though we absolutely do, even if we don't go through that process, right? So that's just an important piece to recognize. And so once the fairness and transparent controls are all in place for all value procurements, it's, I think, secondary important that we also do not lose sight of kind of the commercial sense and where it makes sense. And so we want to hit that right balance. We want to be fair and transparent, but as well, we also want to capitalize on market opportunities. We want to not spend so much money. We want to save money. And so I think it's important that we do what is necessary on both those fronts. And that's kind of that balance that is sometimes talked about in the bylaw. But at the same time, for any procurement that is below $100,000, all the documentation and all the procedures are all there, and are fair and transparent as any member of the community would like to request. So, and also I'd like to just add that we also have a system in place now that, as Des mentioned that speaks to the FMS system. And that system is another extra level of control that ensures procurement is reviewing and approving all purchase orders as before they are committed to suppliers. So we here in procurement actually see pretty much all the spend that is going to suppliers, and we do that check, right? And we make sure, regardless of how big or how small the purchase is, we want to make sure that it was fair and transparent. So I just wanted to add that point to what you're saying. I think what you're saying is correct, but I just wanted to clarify with that little addition as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to point out, and I don't want to get into the debate, but there is a difference in the public eye between fair and transparent processes internally within staff processes and ones that come to council that are in the open council meetings, which is far more transparent because anyone can tune in and watch that, rather than having to specifically ask staff what's going on a particular process, which of course staff would answer, but there's a difference between having to ask for the information and the whole process happening in an open council meeting. I just wanted to make.
Let's, Councillor Stroud, we'll save comments for the business portion because I think that's a very fair and valid point that will be brought up again. But if we can have questions for staff at this point. Are you through with yours for now, Councillor Stroud?
A couple more questions, but I'm going to wait. I'll let some other councillors ask some questions first.
Fair enough. All right. Committee members, further questions? Councillor McLaren.
So Councillor Kiley.
Yeah.
Sorry if I could just back for a second. So since Councillor Stroud is here for the duration of the meeting rather than just for a brief moment while he was scheduled to be at work, perhaps it would be best if he took over the chair at this point and go from there.
Fair enough. Yep, that's fair. That's good. I surrender the chair.
Okay, is there anyone else that wants to ask questions of staff on the briefing? Councillor McLaren.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I really enjoyed the, I guess, the systematic thinking of Mr. Zayan, but I did have a few disagreements. I just had a question. You had mentioned, actually several questions. You had mentioned that you believe that the free market exists. I'm under the impression there's no such thing. It's a myth of neoliberal politics. Could you explain what you mean by the free market, please?
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm happy to address that question. I'll try to not go too much in the philosophical debate, but I do want to clarify what I mean. I think procurement is fundamentally there as a division, as a function, as a field, and as a study to safeguard this what we call free market. And I think what that means on a practical sense and what we do in public spending is ensure that every supplier has an equal opportunity to bid on our projects. And so, what we do is, our entire process that is done through an open competition is all public. So, we have an online platform. I don't know if anybody has seen it, but if you go online, dingo.com/Kingston, you will see all open and available bidding opportunities. You will see clearly when they open and when they close. You will see clearly the evaluation criteria. You will see clearly the comments and the scores, and you will see the ranking. Anybody can see that. It is all completely open and transparent. And so, we are here to send a message to the market that we are a fair and transparent procurement organization. And we want to make sure that we are indeed upholding that. And the credibility of that in the market is extremely important, because if we don't do that, we will find ourselves people just not wanting to work with us. And so we need to uphold that. And just to very quickly close on a philosophical note here, the more that our suppliers in our market believe that we are indeed fair and transparent process, the idea of a fair market is that more innovations come, right? It is a competitive market. Anybody can open up, anybody can bid on our projects. And so with the free market, we hope that, with competition, we hope that innovation happens within the marketplace. And we hope that everybody has an equal ground to bid on our projects. And so that's kind of what we mean by a fair market or free competition. And so we want to make sure that we're creating that platform and ensuring that all suppliers have an equal opportunity to work with the city.
Okay, second question. Recognizing the notion of a free and fair bidding process or ability to bid within the so-called free market, would you consider it free, if I were to do an analogy here, somebody say with deep pockets versus somebody who's not, similar to say a lumberjack bidding against a boy for a lumberjack contest? I'm suggesting to you that a free and fair is only free and fair within the rules that have been established. And these rules seem to privilege those that have the most money. They have the privilege of, we can go as far away as the European Union to procure a particular, whatever we may want to procure, instead of somebody local. So what we're doing is, in fact, supporting those who can have the most money at the expense of the local ones. This seems to be against equity and other principles of government. Now, I grant you that in the business world, we have the search for profit as the underlying motivator, but we seem to have a few more in government. I'm wondering if you have considered anything beyond the profit motive in reasons why we may not want to pick the lowest bid. So for example, in recent memory, we had the big dig in which we did not choose the cheapest one. It was by a considerable difference because we wanted something different than just pure profit or savings. Savings is not the most important thing for a government in this sense. Did that enter into any of your considerations or calculations?
Councillor, through you, Chair, I want to make sure I understand specifically your question here. To reiterate, all our considerations in creating this bylaw is derived with complying with the trade treaty requirements and aligning with our peer municipalities as well. Everything about this bylaw was to ensure that we fill all the gaps with all the requirements and legislation that are upon us here in the city. So
I got that, but it sounded like there was a little bit more than just that. You said also aligning with other ones. I understand that we have no influence and no ability to overturn trade treaties and stuff like that, and we have to follow them. But in addition to that, there are ways in which the subtleties of the policies can be written that can be either helpful or harmful to these other values that governments have that corporations wouldn't.
Right, I understand what you're saying. So through you, Chair, I'd like to reiterate, and this is quite important from a public setting. And so I worked on a similar project when I was at the UN in Denmark. It is illegal in our context to favor local competition, and I'm sure that this is something that has probably been brought up in the past. So I'm not sure if council members are aware of this, but in our Ontario Business Act, our Discriminatory Act, and I'll kind of leave Alan or our legal team to comment should they want to. It is illegal for us to favor or discriminate in any sense, local or any other type of discrimination, for that same reason of maintaining an equal opportunity for everyone. So I'm not sure if I understand the notion of rich or not rich. I think this is a matter of discrimination and the notion of discriminating local, regardless if it's $5 or if it's $500,000. I think that's the notion that we cannot be doing, and I would argue that it would put us in a very, very high risk and be counterproductive to us as a municipality.
Okay, that counterproductivity, I'm not entirely sure I understand what that is, but we're talking about reputational risk also. You mentioned that we may be in a position where the market will not trade with us or will not try and service us. That sounds remarkably unbelievable. It strikes me that most businesses are interested in profit, and if they can find it here, they'll come regardless of what loops we go into. Could you clarify what you meant by this reputational risk? And has any other government in the history of the world ever suffered from this? I mean, I'm thinking of Argentina defaulting like 20 times in 50 years, and still people invested in it. What are you referring to then in those, you mentioned that?
It's a great question. Thank you for the question. And again, Chair, through you, I would like to, before I premise my answer, that we are understanding the context in which we are referencing. I think it's important for us when we are trying to understand other markets and other governments that we reference a government that is at least equivalent in the level of corruption. Argentina is, I would argue, not a relevant or applicable comparison, as it would be very difficult to understand the level of corruption in that country. However, to your point and to clarify what I meant by that, you know, we appreciate that, you know, there are sometimes challenges, and absolutely, there are lots of governments, and even I saw this when I was at the UN, and even at the city, we have been working for the past year trying to increase the number of bids in our project. And so I would argue, absolutely, we want to make sure that we are a customer, a good customer that people want to work with. I'm not sure if anyone has been working for a supplier on the other side, but it's important to understand that suppliers choose their customers. They don't just want to work with anybody. If customers are being difficult, or if they feel that they don't have a chance to bid on that project in an equal opportunity without discrimination, they will simply not spend the time and the cost and the money into preparing that bid. Councillor, this is a very, very cumbersome process to actually respond to one of our bids. It's not an easy task. And so these suppliers, they evaluate this process and they make a decision. They need to make a business decision on which projects they are able to bid on. They don't bid on everything. I can assure you that. And so we want to make sure that we are building that credibility in the market and sending that message that we are fair and transparent. And that's what I mean by, if we start favoring local, I would argue it would be counterproductive. Right? So we need to send a message to the market that we are a fair and transparent, non-discriminatory partner to work with. And I guarantee you, we will start seeing more innovations and more bids on our project.
We'll see more innovations in bidding? Sorry, what kind of innovations are you talking about?
More innovations from the suppliers, right?
Okay, so that's it for now, but just one apology to Councillor Stroud, who put up the Argentina flag. If I offended you in your support for Argentina, I meant none. It was just an example of one that had defaulted several times and had high levels of corruption and still seemed to have suffered no reputational risk. Thank you.
Quite all right, Councillor McLaren. That is actually just the football team that I support, the Argentina football team. I did live there for a year, and I do actually agree that when I was there, the government was a terrible mess, and I think it was fair comment by the speaker at the time. I was just making a little side joke. Next on my list is Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you. I'm going to limit my comments to questions. Understanding the full transparency, you've been with the organization, Ahmed, for a while, but I understand from the presentation that we hired a procurement expert as well for this. And I was wondering, what was the cost of the engagement to have a procurement expert to put this together?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question through you, Chair. We hired, so I'll answer the question in two parts. We hired, obviously, the expert in addition to our expertise internally, mainly because we wanted to have that peer review.
I want the cost.
Right.
The cost I'm interested in.
Absolutely, getting to that. Absolutely. So the cost of the project was around $30,000, which included the review of all 4 or 5 trade treaties. Each of these trade treaties are upwards of 50 pages. It also included the recommendation for the gap analysis of our existing bylaw to where we need to be in terms of the latest changes in our trade treaties. It also included a set of 10 protocols that comply and support the existing bylaw that we are looking to implement over the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay, I just wanted the cost, so I'm gonna just cut you off there. The other question I have with regards to that, did you go to tender? Did you have a competitive bid process for that $30,000 consulting fee?
If I could just ask whoever would like to respond to that question to raise their hand, and then so we'll go to Miss Kennedy or Miss Kennedy.
Thank you for the question. So no, we did not actually do that. We did that following our sole source procedure for under $50,000. We did do some work to look around the market to see what else was available. We obviously wanted to stay within Ontario with respect to the legislation. And we've actually used the procurement office before for other projects. So we were quite well aware of them. They actually do some of our training as well. So we could not find anybody else that had the same experience, particularly in the public sector. So we went through the sole source process.
Yes, and this was likely reported as a one-line item a month later to council. So council would really have not had a line of sight of exactly what this expenditure was for, or the premise behind why we were hiring a consultant. Is that not correct?
That's correct. It would just shown up on the delegated authority report.
Okay, so this is exactly the premise behind why we need to certainly look at a procurement policy. And I'm so glad that you brought this forward and done quite a bit of work. The other question I have is, why would you propose a 5-year term limit? Not come to council if it's a project less than 5 years. And the reason I ask that question will be apparent when I hear your response.
So through you, Mr. Chair, the 5 years, and Ahmed may want to add to this, but the 5-year period is fairly typical across the public sector in terms of what our contracts would be. We do have some contracts where suppliers are not interested in anything less than 5. So that really seems to be kind of a turnabout point or a threshold point, particularly in the municipal world. And so discussing with some of our colleagues in other municipalities, 5 seemed to be kind of the threshold that folks were using. And so that's why we went with that number. I don't know, Ahmed, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, I think that's exactly correct. We just wanted to make sure we're aligned with other municipalities, and also in some situations and in some procurements, like you said, we do want to make it longer than 3 years to make it attractive to just try to get more bidders and create a more of a competitive environment.
Okay. So the premise of that question is simply that the council terms are 4 years, and you're obligating council to be bound by decisions that are being made by staff that basically we don't have an opportunity to have discourse on. And so I see that as problematic, and I think the time frame is too long. On March the 5th, 2019, Kingston passed a unanimous climate emergency declaration. And I see nowhere in this policy of any reference to climate change or how your policy supports proactive businesses that may wish to have a climate change component. We just launched today an opportunity to have a fund for climate projects, and yet the purchasing does not credit or award an opportunity in that regard. Further, we have a time of reconciliation with our Indigenous partners, and there is no reference to Indigenous preference for any opportunities. We have neighboring communities. We have that certainly have small businesses that would like to participate in the procurement process with City of Kingston. They are not referenced. And just today, will announce new business awards for Black members of the business community who wish to get involved with business. Yet there is nothing in this procurement that allows us to address the issues of institutional racism. So I do think there's a lot of work to be done on this. So in particular, for just one question, why is there no reference to our environmental declaration for the greenhouse gas emissions within this policy document?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So the bylaw document is our, as I mentioned earlier, our overriding principles around the procurement process. It doesn't get into a lot of detail, recognizing it's like 30 some pages long. But what it does do is it lays out the principles around which then we can incorporate some of what you're suggesting, Councillor, into our procurement practices. So I believe it's section 3, I think, 2 or 3 of the bylaw, within where the goals and objectives are. I like to call them principles. Talks about incorporating environmental practices and considering environmental factors in our planning process wherever possible. And then there's another section there that talks about incorporating social procurement practices, which considers inclusion, diversity factors in the planning process where possible. So those principles have been set in there to allow us to move forward with some of what you're talking about, Councillor, in terms of some of these initiatives, particularly around the environment piece, particularly around, and I can think of an example because I've been quite involved in it, the living wage piece is another one. So we don't have those details. We haven't finished that initiative. It was put on hold because of COVID and the inability to do some of the public engagement pieces on it at this time. But so we don't have exactly what that's going to look like from a procurement process, but we know it's something that council would like. They've asked us to look at it. We anticipate there will be some type of element built into our evaluation process around it. So these principles, these 2 that I have mentioned, give us that overriding direction to staff that we want these principles considered when you're looking at procurement processes. So that's how we've dealt with it at this point. And then we'll be coming back, obviously, to the committee and to council as we flesh out some of those initiatives and what they'll look like and how they'll affect our planning and our evaluation processes.
One of the issues that I see precipitating through this proposal that you...
It's questions only, right, Councillor?
No, so my question, it is a question, is that as procurement goes through a process, they end up with a comfort level with certain providers of those services. And I don't see anything where in the report where it's disclosed that since we've modernized our bidding service through Bidingo, which I think is a poor excuse for trying to get competitive bids, we don't have anything in the documentation that refers to when that was introduced and the variety of bidders and the ultimate number of individual corporations or businesses that have provided service. And we don't have any breakdown of how many bidders are from Kingston versus throughout the rest of Ontario. There's no so it's very difficult for council to understand. So I'm wondering if there will be more information provided as to the breakdown of where the successful bidders are from, some statistics on that. And maybe there's something that we should be looking at focusing in Kingston because of this COVID period. We really need to be supporting our small businesses. And if we can have all sorts of social policies incorporated within the process, but we say we can't do anything with regards to our geolocation in Kingston, maybe it's something about contributions to local hockey teams or baseball teams or the Boys and Girls Club. Maybe it's those type of contributions that we should have in the appraisal process. So we know that when someone does win a bid, they are actually a contributor to the Kingston community and not just a taker from Mississauga or wherever else bidding in here. So
does staff have enough to answer that question?
Well, I can certainly comment in terms of the information, the data. So we do have some of that data available. We didn't include it in the report because I think, it gets down into the process detail as opposed to reflecting the level of approvals and what's in the actual bylaw itself. But certainly we have that data from 2 sources. We have it from our own system in terms of, because now we've got everything with the technology. But Bid and Go also has some excellent reports. I think we're only about maybe 2 years into Bid and Go, but certainly we get some excellent information back from them in terms of historical use where we have been using Bid and Go. I think the other caution I would say is it's taken us a couple of years to get up to speed with Bid and Go. So we're not going to have sort of a full time period of data because some of it was not done through the system. We're now using it pretty much when we need to, but it's certainly going to take another couple of years to get some of that data. So that data is absolutely available, Councillor, and can be provided to the extent that we can get it out of either of the systems. We didn't include it in here, as I said, just because I didn't see that as being supportive of some of the changes that we're recommending to council at this time, but we certainly could provide it.
No, I certainly appreciate that, and it would be helpful. Similarly, having to chase down the CEDAC and Trade Act, which we did not have with the report, which is a very comprehensive discussion, I think would have been helpful as well. So I'll leave it as that for my questions for now.
Thank you. Now, I think I saw two hands in the interim. Councillor Kiley and not Councillor Bohm saying no. Okay, Councillor Kiley, you're up next. Questions to the briefing.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Stroud, and through you. I'm wondering if staff, perhaps Mr. McLeod, could comment on the legalities of preferencing local. We've heard that we can't do it, but I'm wondering what legislation prevents us from doing it. And then the follow-up to that, I'll anticipate the response. The follow-up to the question would be, have there been any examples of municipalities in Ontario who have either circumvented the law or found a loophole to allow them to promote local suppliers?
Thank you, Councillor. The statute, and I apologize to Councillor Chappelle, I actually sent him a link to a statute. It was a similarly named statute about interest rates. This statute is actually the Discriminatory Business Practices Act. It's been around at least 30 years in Ontario, and it's very clear that the purpose of the act is to prevent discrimination on a number of grounds that are human rights, but it also includes within that nationality, place of origin, and geographical locations of persons employed. So it's very clear, and has been consistent in the 17 years I've been with the city, that we don't give special preference to locals directly in this way. Now, the second part of your question is challenging to me because you're asking me, are there loopholes to law? And that is not necessarily the role of a lawyer to be doing, pointing this out. I would point out one thing, though, that this is a very little litigated statute, that it is complied with through good behavior, basically through the municipalities. I could confirm to you when I go to the Municipal Law Departments Association's meetings, if I was to have this discussion about the statute with them, all the municipal lawyers are very aware of it. It is one we comply with because it is in the structure of a human rights statute, like the Ontario Human Rights Code, like the Charter of Rights in our Constitution. It mirrors that, but it places it interestingly into the context of business practices. Does that assist?
Does help, and I think that it suggests something that I was going to ask. Is our main concern then provincial or international? Because you've answered my question internationally, but there wasn't a mention of the trade treaties that we've heard of. So are we concerned with being brought to the World Trade Organization for preferential procurement? Is that an issue that's at play here?
That is also an issue because the same principles are found in the trade treaties. And we talk about the trade treaties, there's a number of them. If we go back and look at the 2017 report, we're talking principally about the European Trade Treaty in that report, but also the Canadian Free Trade Treaty. And there's also a treaty between Ontario and Quebec. So even though we talk about treaties, those are also interprovincial standard, and generally the same principles in all levels of the treaty as well as the statute. And of course, we don't do things out of fear of getting in trouble. We try to use these as guiding principles to do the positive and right thing in our practices.
Okay, thank you. So continuing with questions, I can't comment on that quite yet. I'm wondering if this policy is updated, would it be possible that a councillor could sit on the procurement committee? It was mentioned on one of the pages of the report. I'm just trying to pull up my notes here. I think it was page 12, talked about a procurement committee. but no reference to any counselor being part of that, just certain senior staff. So could that be revised? Yeah, it's called the Procurement Review Committee. Could a counselor be a part of that?
So thank you, Councillor. So the term committee is maybe a little bit misleading. I think of it more, I think Ahmed referred to it as a peer review. And it's something that's almost informally done now. We're just trying to formalize in the bylaw, but it's more about having certainly procurement and legal subject matter experts at the table. So it's probably a rule to the departments that they need to bring their subject matter experts in whenever there is a procurement protest, or if we're talking about a supplier suspension, those folks need to be at the table, as well as the senior management that would have been involved in the procurement. And we've made this at a senior level, so either a director or a commissioner, as well as another one at that level who could be the peer review around it. So I don't really see it as something that council would get involved in. Council would not have been involved in the day-to-day procurement that would be being discussed, or the process that would be being discussed. And that committee will change. So it just depends on which procurement is being discussed, which director or commissioner might be on there. But it's really just getting a second opinion to and bringing the subject matter experts in terms of making a decision either with a protest or if we are talking something as serious as a supplier suspension.
All right, so no council oversight there. If a decision is made by that pseudo body that council disagrees with, is there any option or opportunity that council would have to redirect staff away from that decision? Or is it kind of said and done, and then it's just up to council to wear it?
I would say at this point, the way we have it drafted, there would not be that ability. We don't have built into the process that decision would come to council. And I would think if we wanted to incorporate that in there, I'm trying to think of how we would do it. Again, the challenge being that council's not in the day-to-day. So we'd have to make sure we could get council or a council member up to speed, just in terms of what the procurement was and what the issue was and what the subject matter experts have been brought into it. So I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but I think we'd have to think about what that process would look like, and how that would work, because we wouldn't know until we get into that process. We wouldn't know at the start of the procurement piece that was going to happen, so we wouldn't have had them involved throughout. So it's certainly something I'd have to think about how we could actually do that.
Okay, and final question for me for now, at least, is about once a decision has been made for procurement, hopefully it's gone all right and we don't have to even worry about the committee I was just asking about. Is it possible that council could ever go back on a contract that's been agreed to? So under $500,000, if a decision is made by staff and council says, whoa, we don't want to do that, is that possible? Or again, is it just, it's said and done without democratic oversight?
So thank you for that question, and our legal folks might want to jump in on this, but no, if the procurement has been done, so if we have issued a purchase order or if we have signed a contract, then to go back means that we either are going to have some financial risk because we're reneging on the contract. We also will have some reputational risk, as Ahmed had talked about, because if we do that too many times, we're going to have suppliers saying, don't even waste your time putting a proposal in, because who knows what's going to happen when it gets to council. They might change their mind. It really puts at question the integrity of our process. So one of the best practices, and something I'd say I have learned over the last couple of years with Ahmed here, is just the integrity of your process and the transparency of that process up front. So, and this is in the trade treaties as well, that when you set your procurement process and you put out your document and you set your evaluation terms and all those pieces, The suppliers need to be aware of that up front, so they need to know how they're being evaluated. You then walk through that process and you follow what those criteria were at the start, and that's how you evaluate, and that's how the contract is awarded. If you then have another body, a council coming and saying, no, I really don't like that selection, I'd rather, let's not do that, let's either put it out again or let's go with this person, then the integrity of that process is gone. And so that certainly would hinder from a reputational over and above the financial pieces of it as well. I think the other piece, just to mention, and then I'll stop in case Alan wants to add into that from a legal standpoint. But the other piece of it is making sure that we're not putting council in a position where they are able to influence those day-to-day decisions. So they are also the body that's setting these policies and these principles for staff to follow. And then if they're also playing a role to actually influence the decision, whether it's in alignment with those policies or not, can put council into a very difficult position in terms of your role as council and the governance. So I just wanted to mention that too, just as another risk around that in terms of particularly being involved in something like the Procurement Review Committee.
And if I could just add to that two things. The first is, this is not a new rule in terms of our purchasing bylaw. We've had for 2.5, 3 years coming up, the rule about the trade treaty and only evaluating based on the criteria that is set out. In addition to that, I would point out, for many years before that, that has practically speaking also been the case, because the easiest cause of action an unsuccessful bidder can bring is that there was either political interference or just non-adherence to the standards that were set out in a tender or an RFP. So there's always been the requirement to be fair. In tendering specifically, the higher value contract rules have always said that you have to follow the rules you set out. What we're doing here is more mirroring the internal, national, as well as international trade treaties rules that also enforce the same basic principle. And I'm also happy to say we've been successful in defending our practices, both in court and negotiating, when people challenge us, to show that we've been fair. So also, this is a practice that city staff have long adopted and followed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we've been on the briefing and the questions now for well over an hour, and we are naturally wanting to get to the business part of the item, and there's a couple other items on the agenda as well. So I would suggest that maybe, unless anyone has any pressing questions of matters not yet covered in the question segment, that we move on to the actual recommendation, if that's okay. Raise your hand if you want to stay in briefings. Okay, so then we would go to, let me just pull it up here. Just one second, I've got so many things on my screen. While I'm looking for this, the clerk did make me aware of the need for the chair to assume the chair from the vice chair if he arrives at the meeting late. It says the vice chair keeps the chair until the chair arrives. So that's what the procedure bylaw says. Anyway, back to the business. Here we go. So that was number 6 briefings. So 7 business 7A, adoption of a new procurement bylaw report, and then the recommendation. And the recommendation is that the Administrative Policies Committee recommend to council the following: that council approve a draft bylaw to repeal bylaw number 2000-134, a bylaw to establish purchasing policies and procedures as amended, attached as Exhibit A to the report, and that council approve a draft bylaw being bylaw to establish a procurement policy for the city of Kingston, attached as Exhibit B to the report. So that's the recommendation. We need a mover and a seconder to get it on the floor, and then we can go back into deliberations. Moved by Councillor.
Mr. Chair, I will point out very quickly that there are no members of the public present, but I just want to
Correct.
mention
That
for
I
transparency.
skipped that. Sorry. I guess had not seen any, but thank you for pointing that out. Normally we would go to members of the public here. So yes, moved by Councillor Cotty, second by Councillor Bohm. So we're not voting yet. So it's on the floor and open for debate. So now you can speak to the motion, you can offer comment, you can of course ask for questions of staff and make amendments, deferrals, anything you like. Councillor McNair.
Okay, thank you. So I cannot exactly support this the way it seems right now. I do support the keeping the integrity and the transparency of the process. It's the process that's problematic as it stands right now, based on what was described as the overriding principles in this bylaw. So right off the bat, the mention of the free market as what we're trying to protect here and trying to keep and fair and free within the free market. Free market is like, it's a childish thought. I mean, no serious economist actually thinks there's such thing as a free market anymore. And it's really presented as a fetish. I mean that in like the literal term of the word, where you like ascribe mythological powers to this immaterial object. And it needs to be exorcised from this thing, because what we're doing here is we are authorizing more and excessive amounts of neoliberal policies. And it's in the nuts and bolts. It's not something that we can get rid of tonight. It's just something that needs to go back. We need to look over this again and take out these assumptions that were really business-centered when we're a government. One thing I would recommend anybody who might want to look at this a little better is a small article. I think it's about 8 pages long, by Paul Krugman, 2008 Nobel Economist Prize winner. A country is not a company. It distinguishes the difference between the mindset and the goals of companies versus governments. And having a business mindset in government is antithetical to the best interests of the people and to the benefits of the society that we're supposed to be guardians of, in that sense. So I would very much support a deferral of this with the goal of softening any of these policies that are really looking at this from the wrong perspective. Yes, we may want to save some money and some time and all that stuff, but not at the cost of the other values that government is supposed to protect and that the markets or that businesses aren't really concerned about. So yes, once we get the process going, I'm very much in favor of keeping council out of that, keeping the politics out of that. But this is the point where the governance is supposed to make the decision about the policy. And I'm not happy with a policy that is so business-centric and concerned with savings, what's considered free and fair within a market perspective as opposed to a governance perspective. These kind of things need to be changed at the nuts and bolts. And I imagine there's thousands of little things that could be done. Now, also to the point about how we have to follow the laws of the of these trade treaties that are imposed upon us. Yes, and I'm all in favor of having a very legal, robust system that we can, set off on its own and leave it alone so we don't have to touch it. But it's in the details that's important. So we can have these principles that come down to us from above, but it's important to put into them at the very lowest level all the things that are of benefit to, within the legal framework, to the local people, to the other guiding principles of government, good governance, equity, fairness, including transparency for the public as well. Equity, stability, that's another one. I mean, if we follow business practices, we get business crises like the 2008 financial crisis and all the ones that have happened before then. That's not what we're looking for, and that's why these other values are important. And the way I see this, it's basically neoliberal policies that are designed to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And in this case, we're the little guys, and we're going to be the ones who are going to be screwing our people around us. So I'm really hoping that somebody will move a deferral, and I would support that because I think this needs to be looked at better and we need to exorcise really some of these ancient spirits, like notions of free market, and move us along in something that's a little bit more modern. Really, neoliberal policies are about 100 years old, beyond best before date. So, yeah, I can't support this as it is, but I would very much support a deferral. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Before we go any further, I just want to remind the committee of the procedure of what this looks like now that a deferral was mentioned. So the councillor mentioned that he can't support it. And he also mentioned he would support deferral. That's two different things. The committee could vote against this recommendation. If we did simply vote the recommendation down, I believe, Mr. Clerk, you can confirm, I believe that means it would go to council in its present form, but with a negative recommendation from the committee. Is that correct?
Correct, Mr.
Yes. So, so if you don't like this recommendation and the attached bylaw and the exhibits, you could vote no to the question. And if the committee chose that answer, it would be up to council to decide on the exact same set of information that would be presented to council. However, in the case of a deferral, the committee retains the item and has the ability to get changes from staff to the item and before it gets presented to council. So if the committee defers this back to the committee with any suggested interim things to happen in the interim, it would come back to the committee before it gets recommended to council. So that's a very important procedural point. And next I saw Councillor Chappelle.
Yes, thank you through your chair. I'm actually going to move a deferral. I'm going to move that this item be deferred to the end of Q2 2021. And the purpose of this deferral would be to allow council to conduct the following with the assistance of staff. Council to complete the annual budget deliberations, participate in our strategic priorities reevaluation, ensure that this policy receives the public consultation it deserves and is listed on the Get Involved Kingston website, in addition to reaching out to the Chamber of Commerce and community groups and other public agencies. As well, have staff provide a supplemental report that would offer and provide further clarity that would allow council to continue to discharge our responsibility as stewards of the public purse.
Okay, thank you. There's been a deferral moved by Councillor Chappelle. Needs a seconder to be on the floor. Does anyone wish to second this deferral? Seconded by Councillor Kiley. So now we go to the debate on the deferral only. And while we do that, Mr. Clerk, if you can keep it on the screen or is there any way of doing a split screen where you can see the committee members and the item at the same time?
Unfortunately, no, we can only share the screen entirely. So I can put it back up for a bit and then let me know and I'll take it back down for you.
Maybe you could toggle it back and forth once in a while at my request. Because our faces are still there on my screen. Does everyone see the committee members still on the side of the screen? Okay. So there it is. It's seconded by Councillor Kiley. And debate is to time, place, and direction. So who would like to speak to this item? The mover gets to go first and then we'll go to others. So you've already stated it in the deferral itself, but there anything you'd like to add to Councillor Chappelle?
Yes, certainly. I do think that this package received just before a long weekend, which is tied in, it's got too many moving parts. I certainly understand the need to comply with treaties, and I don't think anyone on our committee here disagrees that we need to be in further compliance. There's certainly responsibility for that. I have to applaud Councillor McLaren for his astute presentation this evening, because I do believe that the details need to be further flushed out to ensure that we as elected officials in the city of Kingston retain our capacity to deliberate and discuss purchases and the public purse in the best interest of our elected our residents. As elected officials, we do have that one responsibility, and I'm quite concerned that the extent of this particular proposal really erodes our ability to manage that fiscal purse And that is why I think we need a deeper dive and to look at the policy implications, the financial implications, and also have a better understanding, a line of sight of the post-COVID impacts on our budget as we move forward. And which is why I do think it's an important topic to review, to work collaboratively with staff, but certainly come out with something that shares and protects not only the process of fairness for people bidding on opportunities with the City of Kingston, but fairness, transparency, and accountability to the public who elected us to office.
Thank you, Councillor Chappelle. Before I go to the next speaker, let's just take a 30-second break without speaking so we can focus on the 4 points in the deferral so that we can fully wrap our heads around what's in the deferral motion, because that's really all we're supposed to be deliberating. So we'll just take a pause there and we can read the 4 points and consider them carefully. So just a procedural point to the clerk. Item number 3 as written, does that, is it clear? Is there direction to staff in that point? Or could it be interpreted as it's council that would be reaching out to the Chamber of Commerce, community groups, and other public agencies?
Mr. Chair, I'd actually ask that the Chief Financial Officer speak to how she would envision that item number 3 be dealt with at the staff level.
Sorry, having technical difficulties there with the buttons. So I certainly interpreted that would be staff that would be doing that consultation as opposed to council through the Get Involved Kingston platform. There has been some consultation certainly with the Chamber of Commerce and the Kingston Construction Association early on. We actually meet with them on a regular basis to talk about various plans, including our procurement plans. And so they were aware of that. I guess my only challenge would be, as I'm sort of thinking what that would look like, is particularly what I'm consulting on. I think a lot of what's in here is either best practice, it's in our bylaw now, it's in the trade treaties, it's practice across other municipalities. Doesn't mean it's right, but I think that would be if council or if the committee has any direction on specifically, if there's particular areas would be consulting on or what that consultation might look like. But certainly I'm interpreting that would be staff that would carry that out.
Thank you. And would it be contained in what is suggested in point number 4 with the supplemental report? Would the outcome of that public outreach be contained in that supplemental report the way it reads now?
Yes, I would think that whatever information we glean from that could be included in the supplemental report.
Okay. So now that's all the clarification I wanted to get for the points in the deferral itself. So now we'll go back to deliberations from committee members on the deferral. Try to keep your comments directly related to what's on the screen in the sense of, do you need more clarity? Is there a problem with the wording that might send stuff in a direction that's not in our interest, etc. Not really try to stay away from the idea of debating the original recommendation itself in this section, because we're just talking about the deferral. Councillor Bull.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, just in regards to the deferral, I'm going to support this. And just for instance, like number 3, the public consultation through Get Involved, I think it's key that needs to be there. And one of the reasons is there's a local love campaign happening right now that talks about buying local, and there's a lot of confusion and mixed messages about what this actually means. So I think part of the deferral is getting that clarity out there and also having that feedback from the council, because I believe it was mentioned earlier that we wear whatever decision we make on this. So that understanding needs to go out to the public as to what we are governed by as well. So I think that this is a great deferral. I think establishing these things will actually allow us to where our final decision on this with and be able to provide that information to the public when we are questioned on this. And I know I've gotten some feedback, and I know Councilor Chappelle has as well. So this will really help clean this up, I believe, and allow us to really stand by our final decision on it. So I'll gladly support this deferral and look forward to this supplemental information. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bohm. Anyone else? Councillor McLaren?
Thank you. Would Ms. Kennedy, would you consider consulting with me on some of these issues that I tried to bring up under number 3?
Yes, no issues at all. Always looking for feedback. So more than happy to have a conversation, Councillor.
Thank you. And I support this.
So we'll take that as, even though it's not explicitly stated in number 3, that public consultation includes with council, with members of council, but because members of council are members of the public, and we've heard that from the treasurer that she would consider that. Feel free, anyone here, to consult if this passes in the interim. Any other comments from members of the committee? Councillor Kylie.
Thank you, Councillor Stroud. I'm just wondering if staff could comment. Are there any potential negative ramifications for delay? Speaking to time, because we've heard that a lot of what's being recommended is to bring us in compliance with international treaties. So if we're waiting until Q1 2021, is there any harm in doing that?
The question regarding time.
Thank you. Yeah, so no, there's no issues with this at all. I think, we certainly can take the time to do some of this. And if it waits till after annual budget deliberations, I think that gives us some time to figure out what it is that we need to consult on and some of the further information that might be useful for the committee, and pull that together. And frankly, I think I can offer that, a lot of what's in this bylaw today, from a best practice standpoint, we are already doing. So our processes are already supporting it. So we will continue to do that as staff, and the procurement division will continue to roll these practices out and make sure that we are being fair and transparent and following the proper procedures. So I would say from my standpoint that having that extra time isn't going to hinder that at all.
Anything else, Councillor Kylie?
No, I'll be supporting the motion to defer. More information, public input, it's always good.
Okay, so with just one more reminder that, as stated by the treasurer, staff would interpret it, point number 3 in the deferral, as direction to gather information from councillors, member of the public, through Get Involved, through other means, both mentioned in point number 3, but also implied, I guess. And everything will be contained in a supplemental report as written in point number 4. If this, of course, passes. So would anyone wish to speak before we vote on the deferral? Okay, I will call the question on the deferral. All those in favor? And opposed? That passes unanimously. Item is deferred as set out in this deferral. We go back to the agenda for the next item. So this is a supplementary report. Supplementary report, repeal and replace demolition control bylaw number 87-177. Recall that this was deferred from a previous meeting. So the recommendation, just keep in mind this was deferred. So what's in the original bylaw that was already presented to the committee is one of the exhibits, and then item C is the new bylaw, the new draft bylaw. So the two items are related, B and C. So this item B is the supplementary report. And item C is an item to replace the original bylaw with a new draft bylaw. Is that correct, Mr. Clerk?
Thank you, Mr. Actually, to clarify, report B, the supplemental report, in the first clause of the recommendation includes a procedural to delete the recommendation from the initial report that came before the committee at the previous meeting. Should the motion in report B be approved, report C is no longer in effect because it was dealt with as B. So C is just within the custody of the committee and would only be dealt with if a supplemental report was not approved. So item B is basically the report that is before the committee at this time for action.
So item B is the original recommendation, and if it is approved, we don't go to item C because it's out of order. Is that correct?
Item B, the first clause of the recommendation says that the recommendation contained in report number AP 20-021 as presented at the August 8th, 2020 committee meeting be replaced with the following, and that's from item B, which is report 29. So if report 29 is approved by the committee, then the committee does not have to consider report C, which is the original report, because the events that occurred during the consideration of report B would have overtaken the consideration of report C. I hope that was clear.
What I was saying, but I actually had it reversed in what I said. So basically, we consider item B, and we'll see what happens with it, and it'll affect what we do with item C, but it'll all be clear once we get to actually looking at the end. So you'll see the recommendation that the report, which was presented August 8th, be replaced with the following recommendation, which is very similar, but that it says that the bylaw to designate the area within the limits of the city of Kingston as an area of demolition control be repealed and replaced as per Exhibit A of the draft bylaw of Report 29. Report 29 is the supplementary report, which is new to us today, correct, Mr. Clerk?
Yes, I believe so. Your assessment is clear.
Yeah. Okay, so we go to a member of staff to introduce report 29, and then we will have questions and go through the regular procedure. Who would like to introduce the report?
That would be me. I believe my mic is on through you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, you are correct. The two reports, the first report and the second report kind of go together, except for the second report, O29, has changes to the bylaw based on the consultation that we had with the public. So just to kind of give you a brief overview of what we're looking at, the authority to pass the demolition control bylaw under Section 33 of the Planning Act allows municipalities to designate an area within the city as a demolition control area, as long as we have a property standards bylaw in effect. So within these identified areas, council can issue or refuse to issue a permit, as well as impose conditions requiring that the new building be constructed within a specified period of time. So this legislation affords council a greater control over the premature demolition of the city's housing supply and ensures that a plan is in place for redevelopment prior to demolition. So the city's current demolition control bylaw that was passed in 1987 designates all of the city as a demolition control area and delegates authority to the chief building official to issue residential permits. However, there's certain exceptions within that bylaw. So the central purpose of that bylaw as it stands today appears to be for the preservation of architectural historic properties. So although the Planning Act, so the Ontario Heritage Act now allows us to it came into applicable law under the building code in 2006. So we have that trigger to hold heritage properties. There are some properties of historical significance, but unlike the Ontario Heritage Act provisions, the provisions in the demolition control bylaw is not to retain the building, but to ensure that the building is replaced with no unnecessary gaps in the city's housing stock. So under section 33 of the Planning Act, the city cannot refuse to issue a demolition permit where a building permit has been issued for a new building. So as we cannot withhold the permit because of the heritage protection considerations, the provisions in the current bylaw are actually ineffective. So staff are proposing to repeal the existing bylaw and replace it with a new bylaw that regulates the demolition of residential buildings as written within section 33 of the Planning Act to better support the city's housing strategy. And the new bylaw provides the opportunity to preserve the diversity of existing housing stock and ensure the replacement in those residential buildings to maintain an adequate supply of residential units. Staff is also recommending that the process for issuing residential demolition permits under the Planning Act continue to be delegated to the chief building official for consistency.
Great, thank you, Ms. Kapaner-Hunt. Just to reassure all here, we have not lost quorum. Councillor Kiley remains logged into the meeting, but he's stopped his video, presumably oh, there he is. He was attending to some personal matter that we don't need to know, but he did not log off, so we did not lose quorum. That's the rules for the Zoom meetings. So we go now to questions from members of the committee based on what's in the report. Councillor Kiley, go ahead.
Apologies, Councillor Stroud. I was finishing dinner, so I thought I would not subject YouTube to that. I'm just wondering about the delegation to staff. This is a trend that we're seeing even across the two reports dealing with tonight. I'm wondering if we could hear a bit more about what would go into the decision to decide whether a building was demolished on behalf of staff. Could you talk a bit about that criteria, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Through you, Mr. Chair. So today when we issue a demolition permit, so all demolition permits have to go through, we issue a permit through the Building Code Act and the Building Code. So every single one of those demolitions we review for applicable law. The problem with us just doing applicable law with under the Building Code is we don't have that, once they meet the provisions, we can't add additional requirements or conditions to be imposed. So section 33 gives us the opportunity to create an added approval process to ensure that the buildings are replaced in a timely manner. So today with issuing permits, we would assume for demolition that we have a designated substance report, that the project has gone through the health unit. We have site fencing, vacancy of the occupants, any requirement for professional engineers for larger structures, for pre or post tension members, and that we make sure that we're not undermining the level of footings of adjacent buildings. We also circulate all of our building permit applications to other city departments. So planning would be able to take a look at all of our demolition permit applications through that process. And if there was any properties that they were looking at to designate or list, they would have the opportunity to do that at that time. And also with a demolition permit through our department, it allows us to provide a tracking system for those demolition permits so that we can provide for property tax adjustments or future redevelopment credits when someone redevelops a new building.
So it seems very thorough. You've talked about public health, architecture, heritage, and so forth. I guess I'm just trying to get at the fact that this change sees no role for council. Is that correct? Or a committee of council?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, council would be involved. So if there's heritage properties, that would go through the regular process. If we felt, so if we put those additional conditions that are permitted to us under section 33 of the Planning Act, and the customer didn't want to adhere to those conditions, then we would refuse the definition and they could go through council for that as well. So there are a few areas where it would go back through council.
All right, final question from me for now is how often you anticipate that happening, where an elected official would be privy to or part of the decision around a demolition?
through you, Mr. Chair. So I don't necessarily have all the numbers of how many have gone through council. Obviously, heritage properties do. With our current bylaw, I think there was one permit that actually went through council, and there was more authority with that. So the amount of demolitions that would go through council is very small.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Kiley. If I may indulge the committee, I would like to ask a question. So I guess, Mr. Vice Chair, I'll give up the chair for this.
We'll take the chair and recognize you.
So just so I get this all straight. So I know from my experience as chair of the Heritage Committee in the last term of council that there's different lists of properties that the city has. There's properties that are actually designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, whether it's Part 4 or Part 5. There's properties that are on a list of properties of heritage interest. I forget the exact wording, but they're called listed properties. And I know that those require Heritage Committee appearance to the Heritage Committee before demolition is approved in some circumstances. And then I also know that there are areas of interest such as the downtown, like the Princess Street, the downtown area, which is not designated under Part 5 as a heritage district, and has individual properties that indeed are designated under Part 4, but most of the area is not actually designated under the Heritage Act, but it does have a special category in the official plan. So I'm wondering how that intersects the example of the downtown properties that are not designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, but are described in the official plan as an area of interest. How does that interact with the draft bylaw if approved?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. It's Andrea Gummo here from Planning. I can answer that, and certainly if Lisa has anything to add, I would welcome her additions as well. Essentially, when we receive a demolition permit, as she mentioned, it's circulated to Planning, and in Planning, we do a review that involves checking all of the various lists within the city. And we also have done a training for all of staff to identify potential heritage resources that may not have been identified before. So some of the things that we talked about include building materials, but we focus more on proportions, because quite often when a heritage resource isn't apparent, it's because of the exterior cladding that's sort of, hiding it. So we've done that training with staff, and we essentially, if there's any kind of heritage possibility, we flag that and then we look at it further. So essentially it's Planning who would catch that if any of the properties are heritage.
So that's any property in the city essentially could be flagged by Planning, as you just described. But what about areas that are described in the official plan, such as the downtown Princess Street area? I'm sorry, I don't have the official plan in front of me, but I know that it is in an area of interest or something, some kind of language like that.
Yes.
Does that make any difference to the demolition approval as recommended by staff?
Yes, certainly. So that would basically, when the staff member is looking at the demolition permit, they would be looking at whether there is Heritage Act protection, which is the Part 4, Part 5 listed categories, whether it's on our master list, which means that it's not actually protected under the Heritage Act, or whether it's in an area of the city that the official plan considers a heritage character area, which is what you were referring to with the Lower Princess heritage character area and the St. Lawrence ward. So they would flag that and basically look a little closer and just make sure that it's not heritage before they would tell building services that.
So then it's a planning process that interprets the official plan, because that's in the official plan, and not the heritage process and the Heritage Committee. Those things do not come to the Heritage Committee, but they do get an extra level of scrutiny by the planning staff because of their status in the official plan.
Yes, I would say that exactly that's the process. I do note that quite often the Heritage Committee does get involved when there is any of this type of proposal, because they tend to find out about it. So the two processes do quite often happen in tandem.
Thank you. And then my second question has to do with the purpose of the deferral. And if you remember, we received some communication from members of the public quite sort of right before the item came to committee, because the committee agenda gets published days before the committee meeting, and that's when they saw the information, and then they contacted us. But we didn't really have a chance. Anyways, we deferred it so that they could staff could consult with the members that had contacted them with an interest in the bylaw. And so I would like staff to confirm that that consultation took place, in what form, and what was the result of that consultation.
Certainly, and thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I can start this one off, and again, Ms. Capener-Hunt can chime in if I miss anything. We had a great Zoom meeting with the two members of the public, both the CBO, myself, and Jenna Morley from our legal services group was available to answer their questions. We did make some changes based on some of the discussion that we had from that meeting, which included some new statements within the bylaw. Those are outlined in the supplemental report. And we did, I think, kind of successfully explain that the demolition control bylaw doesn't actually have the legal effect that it used to. So we talked a little bit about the idea that we as staff were concerned that it was giving a little bit of a false sense of security in terms of making it seem that it was providing heritage protection, but that it's not. So we did talk a little bit about, the different measures that we're planning to take to ensure heritage protection for properties that haven't yet been identified.
Thank you. I know from reading this supplementary report, that's where it really became clear to me why Section 33 is ineffective. So I was convinced as well by reading the report. And I'm glad that the same happened in your Zoom meeting with members of the public. I also can confirm on that subject that we, I believe, received communication from the members of the public, at least I did, as councillor, that consultation did take place, and they confirmed on their end that it was satisfactory. So I'm happy because of that, and I have no further questions at this time. So thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you. I'll return the chair to you.
Thanks. Anyone else wish to ask questions of staff about the report? Seeing none, we will need a mover. Oh, yes, Councillor Chappelle.
I'm just curious if we hired a consultant to with this, or was this done with the professional staff we have working for the city of Kingston?
Who would like to answer that?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. This was done in-house by staff.
Thank you. So we need a mover and a seconder for the item. This is item B. Go back to the agenda here. I've already read it. It's the recommendation that we repeal. Where is it? Where's the? Hang on, just bear with me here. That the bylaw 87-177 be repealed and replaced as per Exhibit A, the draft bylaw of this report number AP 20-029. That's the recommendation. Who wants to move it? Moved by Councillor Chappelle, second by Councillor McLaren. So this, if passed, would mean that the draft bylaw in the latest report would become the bylaw to designate the area within the limits of the city of Kingston as an area of demolition control, as outlined in the report. Would anyone wish to speak to the item? And Mr. Clerk, you confirm again, we have no members of the public present that wish to speak?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. No members of the public are present.
Great. So would anyone on committee wish to speak before we vote? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor of the recommendation? And opposed? And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much. So therefore, item C is the original report 021, so from August 8th, or sorry, August 6th. And am I correct, Mr. Chair, that this is now moot, as we have already recommended to council that they use a different draft bylaw for this exact same function? Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. It's been overtaken by events and has been withdrawn.
So item C, do we need a vote by committee to withdraw the item, or just automatically?
No, it's automatically removed through the approval of the recommendation, item B.
Okay, so follows logically that item C is withdrawn. Therefore, that we come to the end of the business agenda. Are there any motions, Mr. Clerk?
No, they're not.
Okay, I'll ask members of the committee, any other business? Seeing none, was there any correspondence? There was a piece of correspondence on the addendum. Is that correct, Mr. Clerk?
Mr. Chair, some links that were provided by the Chief Financial Officer were provided to the committee in memo format. It was not a letter from the public.
Right, but it is under correspondence. So under correspondence, there's the links just mentioned to do with the procurement bylaw. And that's it for communications, for correspondence. So it's our next meeting, which would be October 8th. So not that long from now, 4 weeks, I guess. Back on our regular Thursday at 5:30 time. And I'm looking for a motion to adjourn. By Councillor McLaren, seconded by Councillor Chappelle. All those in favor? And that carries. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.